It's Friday, March 10th. I'm headed into the BC auditorium of EXP World to listen to a presentation from a couple of our brokers on depreciation reports. So up in the top left-hand corner, I'm going to Canadian operations. I'm going to Canadian provincial operations lobby. And I'm going to head over to the British Columbia auditorium. So here's a tech room where we can get tech support. Heading over into BC specifically, and I'm going to head over to the BC auditorium. Each province has their own auditoriums for provincial meetings. And they always put me in the back of the room. Must be something I said.
There's a reason for that, right?
I know, hey? It's back from my high school days, all the trouble I got into.
Don't want people to lead by your example. If you were in the front, they would be leading by your example.
There you go. This is an awesome idea, Kate, to do this appreciation report. Scare the crap out of me.
You know, I was just saying, Blake, just before you came in, the Vancouver Sun put an article out this morning about stratas and how to understand the healthiness of a strata corporation. And they actually interviewed one particular agent, and she said an exact amount that should be considered to be comfortable and a healthy CRF. However, I disagree with that because that CRF should depend on this depreciation report. And you have to really understand and read the depreciation report to understand if they do have a healthy CRF.
100%. So, yeah. How can, you can't have a blanket number. Like,
I know.
You can, one strata can have $200,000 in the bank, exact same number of units. Let's say there are 50 units. One has $200,000 in the bank. The other has $200,000 in the bank. But the one's done all the repairs. They have nothing to do. And the other one's got the depreciation report says the building's falling apart. So obviously that number's irrelevant.
Exactly, Blake. And I think that's why it's so important to understand depreciation reports and how to read them. You know, as we're going to cover off, there's so much to understand about depreciation reports, how healthy a building is. Like, it's great to go into a condo and go, wow, that's a beautiful condo and that fits all my needs. But what about the rest of the building?
Yeah.
Got another minute here. I'll just give a few more minutes to see if there's any other people joining in. So just to let everybody know before today's session begins, Kia is not feeling very well this morning. He got a bout of food poisoning, so he's not going to be joining me today. So hopefully Kia will get better very quickly. Morning, Gopal. Morning, Claudia.
Good morning. Thank you for this learning opportunity. It does scare more than the clutter me, but I'm grateful.
Well, you know what? Understanding it is the key, right? Understanding how it works and how you can help assist your buyers in the process, or even your sellers in the process. So I think it's a really important session that is not covered off in many areas, and that's why I decided to do one on this specific topic. Awesome. So it's 9 o'clock. We have a lot to cover today, and please do feel free to stop and ask questions. However, I think I'll probably answer most of your questions as we move along. So we're going to talk today about depreciation reports. And as we all know, depreciation reports are what defines the stability of a building. You know, you need to look at everything all the way around. So let's first look at the framework of a depreciation report. So there's 5 key topics that they cover off in the depreciation report. First, they talk about identifying the project identification. So first, they want to find out what's the purpose of this analysis. They want to establish the scope. They want to develop their work plan, they want to identify the property specifically, and then they want to do a preliminary search. And that preliminary search is, the general area and so on. So then the next thing is they actually look at the property identification and evaluation. So they identify and qualify common elements of the site and the building itself. And then they evaluate the quality and the condition, the current condition of each of those elements. And then they look at the life cycle. They do analysis of each individual element in the building. So they look at the physical age, they look at the effective age, they look at the remaining life expectancy of the element, and then they forecast the timing of replacement. And then the next part they get into is cost analysis of each element. So the replacement or repair cost, including the removal and disposal of a current item. So for instance, a furnace may have, a life expectancy of 3 years. However, what if the main motor blows in the furnace, and they have to replace the whole furnace? Perhaps it's going to be, 20 years or 25 years. So what's that cost going to be of maybe a repair? Maybe they can just repair the motor. Then they have to take the old motor away and dispose of it. So they have to look at all of those factors all the way around. And then they look at the financial analysis, because in order to do all of the replacements and the cost of all of these elements, they have to project the future cost of replacements of components. So that furnace may cost XYZ dollars today, but however, when they replace it in 30 years from brand new, then they're going to have to add the cost of inflation, because the price of that furnace will go up. It will not remain the same. So they're working on estimate numbers. They cannot have exact numbers for that exact reason. And so they do add that appropriate amount for the inflation. And then you have the projected value of the current contingency reserve fund, which we call the CRF. So they look at it and they compound that at a long interest rate. So when they take the CRF, calculate the annual and monthly CRF contributions required, and then what they do is they don't just leave it sitting in a bank. They invest that into interest-bearing securities, so they can make interest on that money, so that money can increase in value over time. So as that money is building in the CRF and they have enough to put in a security, they will invest it into another security to try to make money on that money, which will help offset inflation. So when we look at the depreciation report, let's take a look at the overall view of it. So the depreciation report contains two parts. First, the physical analysis, what's the physical state of the building, and then what's the financial analysis? So what's currently in the CRF, and how much money are we going to need in that CRF so a special levy doesn't have to occur? So just like a home, you have parts and components of that home that wear out. However, you're the sole owner of that home. And so what happens is you will either budget for it over time, or you just know you have a large capital outlay. However, when you're in a building, individuals or owners of each individual unit will buy and sell over time. And so they're using that particular building and the common areas for the time they're occupants of their individual unit. So they will contribute to the CRF, and for lack of better words, the wear and tear of the different elements of the building. So they want to make sure that they're building the CRF at a steady pace that will help pay for these repairs in the building as time requires. So the description, so they look at the physical analysis first, the description and estimate of a 30-year lifespan for common property, common assets, for both the strata lot or limited common strata condition, or limited common property strata corporations responsible for and maintaining. And then they have a summary of the repairs and maintenance work that occurs less often than once a year. So what that means is not regular monthly maintenance or schedules. So the way they term it, it's something that happens less often than once a year. So you may not repair a furnace or a roof more than once a year. You will not. So anything that's a major type component that doesn't need regular repair or replacement, that's what builds the CRF. And then they look at the list of items identified for common property and limited common properties that strata lot owners are required to maintain and repair. So that's the first part. They look at the building overall. You know, what are the various components of the building? So they'll not only look at the interior components, but they'll look at the exteriors as well. Has the building been rain screened? You know, how old's the roof? What type of roof? You know, when's it need replacement? They'll look at the windows and the doors. Oh, Simran, your speaker's open. So they look at all the different elements. How old's the furnace? How old's the hot water tank? What about the carpeting in the hallways? What about the vent entry? You know, what about replacement of the elevators? Because the elevators will eventually wear out, and these can have a lot of large capital outlays. So if you've got an elevator that costs $500,000, the owners don't want to have you come knocking at their door and say, we're going to have a special levy because we have to replace the elevator, and it's $500,000, and you have to put out $50,000 for this elevator for your portion. That's a lot. And so that's why they look at the physical analysis in order to determine the financial analysis. So the financial analysis, they look at the projection of the anticipated maintenance, repairs, and replacement costs of the common expenses that occur less often than once a year and occurring in the next 30 years. So they project these budgets over a 30-year period. And then you've got the description of the factors. So they list all of them out, all the different elements and components of the building, and the assumptions in calculating the anticipated maintenance, repairs, and replacement costs. So then they look at the description of how the CRF is currently funded. So how much is going into the CRF every single month by all the individual strata lot owners. And remember, what each strata lot owner puts into the CRF is part of their monthly strata fee. And it is based on the square footage of their unit. So one unit that is smaller will not pay as much as a unit that is much larger. And then they look at the current balance of the CRF minus the approved expenditures that have not been yet withdrawn, and at least 3 years of cash flow funding model for the CRF they examine for maintenance, repairs, and replacements of the Strata Corporation's responsibility over the next 30 years. And so let's take a look at the Strata depreciation report. So what information is all contained within it? So the very first part of it, they're going to talk about the subject property. What's the name of the building? What's the strata plan number? What's the civic address of the property? And what's the contact details of the strata company or the strata manager? Then they're going to establish the date, the effective date. So this would be the date that the report is prepared. And then they look at the author of the report. Who's preparing this report and examining the components of the building? What are their qualifications? And what's their contact details? How can I get a hold of this individual? And then they look at the project number. So the person preparing the report on behalf of their company will give each project a unique identifying number for the report. And it's assigned by the company or the author of the report. And then they look at the building components themselves. So they will itemize each of the components, they'll provide details on it, and they'll talk about the age. And when we talk about the age on these, They look at the physical life, they look at the expected life, and then they look at the remaining life. So perhaps if we look at a roof, it may have a 30-year life expectancy, and perhaps that roof is only 10 years old. However, depending on the weather conditions and other conditions that exist where that building is located, perhaps that roof has the wear of a 20-year-old roof. So they have to look at the remaining life expectancy of that particular building or that particular roof and where the building is located. And then they also talk about, they take a picture of the outside of the building so you know what the building looks like, and they talk about the year the depreciation report was formed for a brief overview. However, on it they give an exact date. And then it's prepared for, and they talk about again the building name, the building address, and the actual date it's prepared. So please be aware of all of that. That is the first part of the report. And then the next part, they talk about the introduction. So in this, they talk about what is the purpose of the depreciation report. So it is a requirement under the Strata Property Act in BC. They look at the long-term financial planning forecast. They provide estimates of timeframes for the replacement of common property components. They provide their opinions on the budget for the CRF. So they look at what's currently in the budget, they look at the components, and they provide their opinions. Is the CRF healthy for this building or is it not? What are the actions that the Strata needs to take or should take? What are the recommended actions in order to get that CRF in a healthy state for that building? And then they provide the Strata with these options to meet the long-term financial expenditures. And they also provide an inventory of the common property components. And then the next part is they talk about the general description of the building. So they name the building again. They talk about how many units. So in this particular case, on this report that was pulled, it includes 131 townhouse units, over 20 wood frame buildings, 8 buildings at the center of the complex, and have 4 stories, while the remaining building have 3 stories. Each townhouse has a private on-grade garage, and there's an amenities building with an exercise area. And then they talk about it. The complex was constructed in 2004. They go on for the purpose of the report. And then they talk about the management and the council reports that there's no shared facilities with any adjustment properties. So this is where they're getting the scope of what this actually entails. And then they talk about when the Strata's fiscal year end is. So this is for the author to understand the subject property. So they have a brief understanding of the description, the general description of what is being evaluated in this report. And then they go on to talk about the reserve fund items. What are they going to look at? So this is the Strata versus the owner's responsibility. What's the Strata responsible for? And what's the owner responsible for? Here they talk about Strata's responsibility being the structural frame, the balconies, the roof, the exterior cladding, windows, and doors, including the garage doors, and site finishes. However, the owner's responsibility, on the other hand, is the interior suite finishes, the suite-specific plumbing, the suite HVAC units, including furnaces and hot water tanks, and the suite-specific electrical fixtures and associated wiring. As we know from other Strata courses, that anything inside, for lack of better words, the 4 walls of the Strata lot are the Strata lot owner's responsibility. Anything that occurs within that are their responsibility. Anything that lies between the walls or outside leading to the common areas whether it be hallways or stairwells or whatever, that is the strata lot's responsibility. So they specifically talk about that and make it very clear here, because these are townhouses. And then they make general assumptions. So here the assumption that they've made about hidden conditions, predicting technical performances and ongoing maintenance needs for the common elements. And they describe the repairs and replacement rationale documents, what they're making rational decisions on. And they talk about the limitations of their professional liability certificate, because each individual company and each individual that is preparing this report must have professional liability insurance. So the strata lots can review that. They will provide that certificate for the strata council to review. And then they talk about their general operating costs. And the general operating costs are those that occur on a regular monthly basis, or, you know, as they describe, more often than once a year. So those are your operating costs. Okay, so in this particular case, they talk about costs below about $2,500 are generally considered operating costs. And then they talk about the capital expenditures. And when we talk about the capital expenditures, well, what are capital expenditures? Well, they talk about present cost, the total project cost in today's evaluation. So if they were to budget, say, the cost of a furnace today versus the cost of that furnace in 20 years. So they look about that. They look at the present cost, and then they look at the first occurrence. So the first fiscal year in which the project is anticipated to take place. So they look at the following fiscal year for that. Sorry. And then next, they look at the cycle. How often a project happens. For example, the number 1 in the next column will cause the project to happen every year, where the number 5 in this column will cause the project to occur every 5th year. So we're going to examine that chart on how to actually read the depreciation reports based on that. And no occurrence, how many times a project is anticipated to occur during that 30 years. If the column is left blank, that indicates the project will repeat throughout the term of the report. So when we look at this, they look at from it capital cost, Canada Revenue Agency for capital cost allowance depreciation. They look at buildings as class 3, as strata buildings, which is a 5% depreciation. So most buildings acquired before 1988 are included in class 3 or class 6. So they do vary. This is for income tax purposes, as well as classifying with the depreciation. So if you require a building before 1990, that does not fall into a class 6, you can include it in a class 3. One of the following applies. You acquire the building under the terms of a written agreement entered into before June 18th, 1987. The building was under construction by you, for you, on June 18th, 1987. And it includes a class 3, the cost of any additional or alterations made after 1987 to a class 3 building that does not exceed the lesser of the following two amounts: $500,000 or 25% of the building's capital cost, including the cost of additions or alterations to the building included in class 3, class 6, or class 20 before 1988, and any amount that exceeds the lesser amount above that is included in class 1. So let's take a look at what that means. So when we look at the actual depreciation report, they provide the item numbers, they provide a description, they provide the class, which we just discussed, they have the status, They have the prescribed class. They talk about the year of first occurrence. They talk about the cycle. They talk about no occurrence. So 2017 was the year this report was prepared. So that's going to be your first column. And then they do the projected costs from there. So you'll see in the general prescription description, the first one is structure. So then they itemize all the items under structure. Then they talk about the building envelope. They talk about fire safety. They talk about the site itself. And you will see the class, the forecast, the cost, the year of first occurrence, the cycle, or no occurrence. And then you see the projected budget. So in this, if we look at this first page, so we see in 2019, we're going to start having a little bit of occurrences on this first, and this goes on for several pages, so you've got to read all of them. So in 2019, you look at, they've got, 20 some thousand dollars, under $30,000 on this first page. But if you look at 2020, wow, there's going to be a capital outlay on this first page of $230,000. Then we move through to 2023. There's some more expenses coming up. And then we look at 2024, 2025, and 2026. Wow, there's some big capital outlays coming there. So we want to really pay attention to these capital outlays and see what all these outlays are for the budget in comparison to the budget. So we look at the next page 2 of the report, and they're quite detailed. They provide in-depth knowledge. So the next, they look at the electrical. They look at the miscellaneous. They look at the structure, the building envelope, the fire safety, and the site again. And then you see the projections again. They have it forecasted, they have the class, they have the cost, the first occurrence, the cycle, and no occurrence. And then you see the capital outlay. So if you take a look at each one of these columns, you're going to find out what the capital outlay is that they have coming up on each component. And so you move on to the next one again. It talks about the HVAC, the plumbing, electrical again on that, the miscellaneous, the structure, the building envelope, fire safety, and the finishes, the furnitures and equipment, and also the site. And again, you're looking at a bunch of capital outlays. So what you want to do is take all of these pages, put them one above the other, and go through column 2017. What's it going to be? 2018. If you look, each one of these pages is another year. So each page adds up, starting at the first year of this report, and it goes up for 30 years. Because remember, this is a 30-year projection. So you want to know how much money is going to be outlaid in each project for each of the years coming. And this is when you look at this and what the costs are going to be, you're going to determine, is there enough money in the CRF? Is there enough money that there's not going to have to be a special levy? Imagine your people buy this building and they find out there's a special levy. However, if they take a look at the depreciation report, and they see what years the capital outlays are going to be, they can compare it to see if there's enough money in the CRF. The other thing is, it can help determine if they hear about a special levy coming up, and it's throughout the AGM, that they're talking about a special levy, say for the furnace, and you see the furnace is budgeted at, $250,000 or $500,000. Then you're going to have to say, okay, is there enough money in the CRF to pay for that when that comes up in 1 year or 2 years? Perhaps that would be a huge factor in the offer that the buyers are going to make to the seller. perhaps the seller, if it's coming up, will understand that and adjust the price. However, if there's a special levy that has been voted on and is going to be due before a buyer buys, while the seller is still in possession of that unit, that seller is responsible for any fees due. If the fees are not due until after the buyer takes possession, then the buyer is responsible. So let's say we're doing a window replacement and there's 4 installments. The seller has paid 2 installments of those windows, and the other 2 installments are due after the buyer takes possession. Then the buyer is responsible for paying that. So perhaps that's something that will be worked in the offer on that they can negotiate, and that perhaps that's deducted on the statement of adjustments. It's all about negotiation. So understanding what is due when, what the forecast is, and the financial stability of the building, as well as the components, like we were discussing before this session began. I believe it was Blake that mentioned that you can have 2 buildings. They can be the exact same age. One can have all the components replaced. Everything has been replaced. And they have, say, $100,000 CRF, where you can have the same building, same age, and they have very few components replaced, and they have a CRF of $200,000. That may look really good. However, none of the components have been replaced. So that may have a huge bearing on the buyers. So it's one of the things that you want to take a look at. You know, as I mentioned this morning, the Vancouver Sun had an article out there, and the agent gave a rule of thumb of what should be in the CRF. How can you have a rule of thumb of what's on the CRF when you haven't looked at both the physical and the financial components of the building? One is important as the other. You need to take a look at both of those elements. Just saying that, yep, if there's XYZ dollars, you know, say 10% of, you know, the strata fees are put into the CRF every month, we're good. Not necessarily. Perhaps when the building was brand new, they had very little that they were inserting into or paying into the CRF. And perhaps they used some state-of-the-art technology that didn't last. I remember when one brand of shingles a number of years ago decided they were going to use a recycled product in their shingles. And after 5 years, their shingles were all getting fish mouth, where they're curling up at the corners. So that was something that I had to renegotiate with the sellers, because the shingles were not going to last. And that has some bearing on what's in the budget. So the shingles had a 30-year life expectancy, but that doesn't include labor. So labor, remember, is about half your cost. So you want to take a look at all of those factors, both the physical components as well as the financial components. So then they go on and they talk about the financial analysis of this building. So we've looked at the report and we see what their projections are in each of the major components. However, we've got to analyze the financial. So the Strata Property Act establishes regulations for minimum contributions into the CRF based on the operating fund. And they believe that special levies should not result. However, we know that's not always true. Perhaps the windows are out of warranty and they aren't withstanding, you know, the temperatures, maybe extreme heat or extreme cold, or perhaps they used a new state-of-the-art material that didn't last. So they have to look at all of that funding. And if there's not enough money in the CRF because it wasn't budgeted, then that's when special levies occur. Perhaps the foundation gave out. Perhaps the building needs repiping earlier than expected because of salinity in the water. And we know that does happen, especially here in the Lower Mainland. So they look at all the different scenarios to try to ensure as best as they can that special levies don't occur. However, we do know that that's a perfect world and that does not exist. So they look through the CRF, they look at the opening balance before the report starting year, and then they look at the annual CRF contributions for the report starting year. They look at any special levies that are anticipated for the report starting year. And what do you mean anticipated? So, like we said, there may be a roof that's 30 years. However, it looks like it's been there for 20 years. So they have budgeted, say, for perhaps to replace that roof in 30 years, but it maybe needs to be replaced in 10 years. So would they look at any special levies occurring in that reporting period? Perhaps that's going to happen this year. And they look at a specific minimum balance. So they look at the present value of the lowest allowable CRF balance as they set by the Strata Council. And then they look at an estimated annual interest earned on the savings. So how much money are they earning on the investments that they have at the current rate? At the rate that they've got. It may not necessarily be the current rate. So something that you invested a couple of years ago when interest rates were down, you're going to get a very low interest rate. If you were to invest that same amount today, you would get a better interest rate. So they have to look at the interest rate they invested at, not the current rate. And then they look at an estimated inflation rate used to increase the estimate cost of repairs and replacement. So they reflect on the expected average trends, not necessarily the current rate. So they look over a period of time. What do they think the inflation is going to be? And then they look at the cash flow. And they do an analysis of the current cash flow. And they look at the contributions that are there. They look at the minimum balances that was specified by the Strata Council. And for each scenario, they have the algorithms that optimize itself so that at no point in time will the Strata be contributing to more than is requested to the fund in the future expenditures. So then they look at the funding scenarios that should be read across each row from the left to the right in the logical flow. So as we've seen, each page, the year adds up, and they do it over a 30-year projection. So your buyers are most going to be affected. What's going to happen in the next 5 to 7 years? More specifically, the first or the second. So you wanted to take a look at all of those columns to see in order to read the depreciation report. So just note that the financial scenarios considered only the CRF components of the strata fees. They're not looking at the daily operations on the depreciation report. They're only looking at the capital expenditures that occur more often than once a year. Okay, so just be careful and understanding that the depreciation report is for long-term financial planning. It has nothing to do with the operational budget. Remember, a strata fee consists of a portion for the daily operational as well as a contribution to the CRF each month. And then, if we look at the current contributions and special levies, so what they do is they look at different scenarios. And so they look at the current contributions and special levies. So what's happening right now? they take year 2017 and they project it out over the next 30 years. And then they look at the estimated interest rate that they believe will occur, and they look at the number of units. So then they estimate how much is going to be of those funds over, if you were to stay at this, the current contribution with a special levy, is there going to be enough money in the kitty? Using the first scenario. So the first scenario shows us each year, if you contribute annual CRF contributions at the current level. Special levies are shown in the other contributions column. So if you see the other contributions column here, that is special levies. And levies are calculated to cover funding shortfalls in each year where the expenditures exceed savings and are only as large as necessary to maintain a specific minimum balance. This approach puts off savings for larger projects of financial burdens towards future owners. So they're saying right here, so right now, the current owners are going to have less contributions, but we're going to shift the liability of the expenditures on future owners. And then they look at the second scenario. And again, they look at it over the next 30 years, the current balance. And then in the second scenario, this scenario shows a large initial increase in the annual CRF contributions to a level which will fully cover future expenditures within the next 30 years. No special levies are needed following the initial increase. Small annual increases adjusted for inflation so that the contribution levels remain consistent in terms of today's dollars. So this approach represents a long-term savings plan. So what this means is that in the second scenario, your strata fees will increase. Okay? And you will not have any other special levies. So there's two options that are put forth by the preparer when he or she is looking at this report. And then they look at a third scenario, which is called the phased-in contribution increase. So again, projected over 30 years, they look at the opening balance, they look at interest rate, and then from there, this scenario shows large increases from scenario 2 out over several years. This approach still arrives at a fully funded position at the end of the phased-in period, but breaks the increase down into smaller, more manageable increases. And this approach represents a middle ground funding by a special levy and becoming fully funded the next year. So when we look at these different approaches, they have to look at the structure first. So they look at the structural frame of the building, and it's based on the visual views. And they look at the below ground moisture level that's protected. They look at the building's location, the area of the building, and so on. And so they look at all the different components of the building that's going to need required in order to meet the financial long-term outlay that's required for this building. So what happens is, after this report is prepared, it's presented to all the owners of the building. And they evaluate through the AGM this whole report, and they'll see, are they going to choose stay with the current option, go to option 2, or go to option 3? What do the owners of this building want? And so those are the things that you need to look at when you're looking at this depreciation report. Is there enough money funded right now? And if the owners, because remember, your client is only one owner, regardless of how many people, they only have one vote per unit in a residential. And so is there going to be enough money, or are they going to vote to increase the strata fees? Are they going to vote to have a special levy? Remember, all the owners of a strata that own in a strata building, all have a say and they all have a vote. And it's a majority vote that will occur. So your voice is only one voice, or your client's voice is only one voice of one of many. You know, they say a strata is a corporation. It's like a corporation, absolutely. And it is called a corporation, but it's different than what we know corporations to be. So strata can be sued, and they can sue. So when you're buying a strata unit, you're buying into that corporation. So if somebody sues that strata corporation, you will be part of that. If the strata corporation sues, you will be part of that. So if it's an owner within the strata that sues the strata corporation for whatever reason, they don't have to contribute to the legal fees because they have their own legal fees. All the rest of the owners have to contribute to the legal fees. So that could all have part in this as well. However, they're looking to the long-term stability of the building itself. So then they look at, like I said, the structural framework. And then when they look at the structural framework, then they move on to the balconies and the landings. How are they? What are they constructed of? How are they lasting? You know, what do they expect that's going to need to be done to those? You know, I've seen low-rising balconies. It's been too big, has tried to go underneath, and they've affected the balcony where they've taken a chunk off the balcony. And guess what? It may be the balcony of one strata lot owner. However, it's still owned by the strata. And so that would have to come out of the strata's CRF. So those are things like that you have to evaluate, that know, as well as a great laid out plan is, that there's other things that can affect this depreciation report that may not necessarily be included in this depreciation report. So there's all those things to be aware of. However, what this is looking at is the components of the building right now, as of today's date, how they're wearing and how they're lasting. When do they feel they need to be replaced? So perhaps a balcony that was constructed of cement, perhaps that cement that was used was not good cement. Perhaps it wasn't mixed right. Perhaps they didn't put the right consistency in it. And perhaps all those balconies are chipping. And it's no longer under warranty. And it was something that was not expected and not calculated in to this depreciation report. And so perhaps that would be a special levy that they have to do all the balconies. Perhaps, a membrane. I've seen one building in Richmond where the membrane had gone over the garage. However, over the garage was a beautiful outdoor sitting area with plants and trees and gardens and so on. And that membrane failed. So they had to take all of that away, and it was a very large capital outlay, which caused a special levy. That was not budgeted into this depreciation report. So as much as a depreciation report provides very, very valuable insight into the building, there are extenuating circumstances that are not calculated into this. So they look, for instance, at here, they look at the balcony condition survey. What's the present cost? What's the inflated cost? What's the first occurrence? What's the cycle? The number of occurrences? What's the class? And what's the status? So they look at that specifically here. However, like I said, there could be extenuating circumstances that have not been considered. Perhaps they don't see it at this time. And then the projected notes, this item allows for a balcony condition evaluation to visually review the condition of the vinyl membranes and the structural components at sample areas, evaluate the repair needs, and to use the information to develop a scope of work and budget for future balcony structure repairs. This budget includes an allowance to remove sample areas of soffits to review the condition of the concealed structure. So remember, some things are concealed. You can't see everything. You can only view, and they can only give their opinion on what they view. So in this case, it has a membrane, and they may be reviewing sample balconies. However, maybe they're reviewing them all on the north side of the building, and it's the south side of the building where the sun has been hitting that has rot underneath for whatever reason. So as much as they can project on this and try to give an estimate of what's happening, they have to look at the building as a whole, and they may not see everything. So they look at waterproofing the balconies and landings. They look at replacement of balcony guards. In this case, it says that they're metal picket. So this item allows for replacement of the balcony guards. This project is timed to occur with the balcony re-waterproofing projects to minimize the access costs. But what happens if they can't do it at that time? It could add the cost of the project up. So they're making certain assumptions, as mentioned earlier on in this report, on when these can occur to save money. But what happens if they can't coincide that at the same time? And then they talk about additional access costs will apply. So that has not been budgeted into this report. And the access costs are included in the balcony waterproofing projects. So if they don't do these two things at the same time, it could increase that, which could then cause a special levy. So there's many reasons why special levy. They're making assumptions on the repairs of this building envelope. And then they talk about the history of the repairs. What has happened previously? Well, if we look in this one, they repainted the exterior wood components and locally replaced sealers. And the cost of that was $180,000. So there is a lot of cost that could occur in between that may not necessarily be expected. And one would think, okay, they're replaced now, but however, it doesn't mean that repair is going to last another 30 years. They're hoping it will, because on the general scale of things, that's when the average repair should be reoccurring. And we say average. Again, it depends on the area of the building, the quality of the material that was used. So there's a lot of outside factors that need to be taken in, and when we're reading this depreciation report, to consider that. So as much as we read the depreciation report and we see the numbers that are there, we actually need to read it. We just can't look at the numbers and say, this is scenario 1, 2, 3. They're opting to do one at this time and stay with one. You have to look at the long-term projections and what that means. If they put recurring cost off to former owners or to future owners, guess what? Your buyer is going to be one of those future owners. So how is that going to affect your buyer? But again, remember, you're reading these reports for the information to provide general information to your client. You're not an expert in reading these. Today's session is to give you knowledge on how to read these depreciation reports and what it means for your client. And again, we've looked at the building envelope, which is a major component, and part of that building envelope is windows. Perhaps the windows are single pane, perhaps they're dual pane, perhaps they're triple pane. How have the seals lasted? Has one broke? Has one cracked because of the sun. Maybe the building is so airtight that the windows crack. There could be very extenuating circumstances because the environment in which the building products are installed has a huge bearing. And then from there, we move on to the exterior doors. Perhaps the doors need replacing. You know, I looked at one building not long ago, and the patio doors in the project, yes, the whole project, the patio doors were installed inside out. So the outside was installed inside and vice versa. How does that impact that particular building? So you have to look at that as well. You know, is the building then going to take all the doors out and have them replaced? And are they going to have them turned around and placed the right way? So those could all be costs. Perhaps you're going to live with them until it's time to replace them. So you want to look at all of those items when you're looking at a building. It's just not what's on the depreciation report, it's what you actually see physically as well while you're at the building. And then they talk about roofing. We can't get up on the roof. We can't see the roof. You know, they're buying a Strata. Their home inspector is not going to go up in the roof. So all the components that are part of the Strata, your buyer will be relying on this depreciation report rather than having a home inspector go on and inspect the whole property. What a home inspector would inspect in a Strata is the unit itself. And they may look at the depreciation report, however, they are being paid to look at the interior of the unit that the people are actually buying, because that's what they're buying. They're buying the interior of the unit and they're buying into the corporation. This will give them insight to the rest of the building and the components and the wear and tear. So this is, instead of a home inspection for the whole building, this is what your buyer would be relying on for the common property. And so on this, as we know, these are some larger capital outlays. And if you don't have a good roof, you know, the rest of it, as I say, doesn't really matter. In this one, we look at the history of the roof. So we want to look at how is the roof standing up. In this one, we see that they installed downspout extensions, and they improved the roof drainage. Oh, they improved the roof drainage. So that tells me what was happening with the roof was water must have been pooling on the roof. And the cost to do that was $75,000. And so then we look at the fact of, okay, how long is this roof going to last? It also tells us here, if we're looking at this, it's an asphalt shingled roof and it's sloped. The valleys are protected by sheet metal. The attic spaces are ventilated through the eaves opening with perforated soffits and roof vents. The roof have pre-finished aluminum eaves for troughs and downspouts for drainage. The downspout discharge into the below grade system. And then they further go on about that it's similar on the balconies. So you need to look at all of these things with your client and sit down. You know, you talk about the roof when you've got a PDS, what type of roof? In a Strata, they don't necessarily know what the roof is, and that's where you'll go to this. They're only giving you information that they know. Has there been any special levies? How many units are in the building? Is there a car parking? Is there a storage parking? The PDS is only giving you that general information. This is where you turn for more specific information on this particular building. And then fire safety is very important in these buildings. So they talk about the fire safety systems because there's so many kitchens and so many different people that live in the units. So they want to make sure that if there's a fire in the building, that the people can get out safely. So they have what they call the fire alarm control panel. And it's usually located in the electrical room. So you need to look at that fire safety panel. And then, is there heat detectors? Is there alarm monitor system? What is in there? Is there a fire suppression system? What types of systems do we have Sorry, somebody's asking a question here. Just bear with me 1 second. Since we are not an expert for reviewing the depreciation report, shall we suggest clients to seek independent advice from Strata Doc Review Company? My question is, what should or not do in terms of a Strata document review? Yeah, good point. So yes, at the end of today's session, I do provide some Strata reading document companies, and there's many more out there. I do recommend that agents do send their clients to Strata reading document companies. Give them 3 to choose from, just like you would a home inspector.
Kate, I have a question regarding a leakage. I'm sorry if it's the right time to ask the question, or should I ask in the last?
No, go ahead, Vikas.
Okay, Kate, if there is a leakage, I'm talking about particularly about the condos building. If it is a 4-story building and there is a leakage on a 4th floor and it comes on a 3rd floor as well, right? Who is responsible? Strata Council is responsible, or individual owners are responsible for those leakages?
That's an excellent question, Vikas. Excellent question. So where does the water leakage originate from? Inside the unit, under the kitchen sink? Is it from, a leaking toilet that's leaking, say perhaps the supply line? Is it originating from inside the unit? If it's inside the unit, so inside those 4 walls, then it is the Strata unit owner's responsibility of that individual Strata lot owner. So for instance, in my building, somebody just had a leaky toilet and it was from the supply line. And so that unit lot owner was responsible for not only repairing their own unit, repairing the damage to the unit underneath. And remember, right now, the Strata deductibles are very, very high because of this. So one of the things that I suggest is, when your buyer is buying this property, perhaps have all the supply lines changed. Because if that is determined to come from their unit, the fire truck's going by my house. Bear with me 1 moment. My apologies. So if it's coming from within that unit, then it is their responsibility. So if those supply lines are 20 years old, 10 years old, it will be worth them calling a plumber in and changing all those supply lines, because the deductibles are so high now. However, if that pipe breaks from within the wall, in the middle of the wall, or on the other side of the wall that is common property, then that is the Strata's responsibility. Okay, so it depends on where it originates from. And believe me, they will do their investigation to trace where the began. Because the Strata doesn't want to pay for it, Strata lot owner doesn't want to pay for it, but originated from somewhere. So they'll have to dig down and find out where that originated from. So a new building, you just want to make sure that all those are tightened, and it may be worth the price of a plumber to get them in to make sure that everything's tight and there's no failure. So I remember selling a unit that sat vacant for a couple years after it was being built. I sold the unit. The buyers went to inspect the unit just before they took possession, and there was a leak. And so it was the seller's responsibility, because it was the main supply line from the toilet, because the toilet hadn't been used. Seller no sooner took possession of the unit, within 6 months, that supply line was not installed right, and there is another leak. So now the buyer became responsible for that leak. And remember, the deductibles are very high now. So you just want to make sure that when your clients are in these units, that they're making sure those supply lines and everything are tightened. They don't want to cause flooding. And that is why premiums are so high. So if you look at a Strata building and you see really high premiums on that Strata building and really high deductibles, it's because more Stratas have insurance claims than single family dwellings because of leakages. So you may want to look at the insurance, and that's another indicator. Okay, and look at the deductibles. The clients can buy, like the buyers can buy down, and they can sometimes, I see them where they're buying a second policy. They're buying the first policy, which is their general liability, and then they're buying a second policy, buying it down, say for water coverage with a lower deductible. So that does occur. Does that answer your question, Vickers?
Yes, Kate. Yes, Kate.
Perfect. That was a good question for everybody's knowledge. So then they look about on the finishings, and they look at the furniture and the equipment. So they look at the amenities room in this particular one. What are the finishings there? What's the kitchen look like? What's the bathrooms? What appliances are in there? What about the exercise equipment? What about games room? Because that is all owned by the Strata. And if something happens that this building is burnt down, then the Strata is responsible for replacing this property and putting the finishes back to where they were, the furniture and equipment. So however, that may need an upgrading. Perhaps the building was built in the 1970s and it has a nice bright red kitchen. And now that's no longer the style. And they may want to update that kitchen. So what's the cost going to be to make the updates to the equipment and to the kitchen? You know, equipment, as we know in a gym, is more technical. It can measure blood pressures and so on and so forth now, where the old ones had the old dial speedometers. You know, everything is digital. So what's the cost of replacing that over time? So they take a look at that too. So not only just the building, but what the building owns. So that building owns the common areas. They own the furniture. They own the equipment. And so what's the cost of going to be to maintain that equipment or replace that equipment over time as well? So that all has to be taken into consideration. And a big one is the fact that they have to look at the site as well. So where is it located? What's around it? In this case, they have that the soft landscaping includes trees, shrubs, grass areas throughout the complex. And we assume that the soft landing will be maintained in an operating expense. So they're saying they're saying that the operating expense will look after the daily maintenance of the outside. But then they go on and they talk about the other features that may affect this building. The wood stairs at the landing with paint and wood picket handrails. And they talk about that the painted wood building signs. There's 2 located at the front entrance. And then they talk about the wood picket fencing along the north, south, and east sides of the site, separating the backyards of the adjacent units. There is generally gates in to each yard, and there's chain link fencing along the east side of this site. There's wood privacy divider panels between the patios and the adjacent units, and there's wood pergolas. There's 6 large ones at the main pedestrian entrance and 7 smaller ones at the units fronting. And then there's also wood retaining walls between the 4th-story buildings. And then there's mailboxes near the center of the complex. All that needs to be maintained. So somebody asked here, in the event that the Strata has done Band-Aid fixes, is pending a Strata wind-up, an indefinite time frame where levies will be due for repairs if doesn't get brought out in a shorter time period, our client wants to go ahead with the purchase. Is there a clause that we conclude that the buyer would acknowledge the risk? It's called a buyer's acknowledgement. We talked that there's a session in BC Education called Buyer's Acknowledgements. I'll review that one. Strata wind-ups are a whole different category. Strata wind-ups generally when they come in, and we're not going to cover that session today, but that's an excellent one to do. I believe Simran brought that one up before. With Strata wind-ups, generally the developers will come in and they'll offer a package, and they look at each individual unit. and they'll offer money for that. Sometimes they'll even allow them to stay, in the unit a year after the deal closes, and they'll give them the buyout. But they also have restrictions on that. Generally, you can't rent it out to anybody else. You have to pay yourself. So there's a whole lot of restrictions around the Strata wind up. If you have a specific question on that, you can reach out to me later. Question: Is there, if there's a leak in a Strata common area, and due to that leak, the water goes into the unit, then does the unit damage? Who is responsible, the Strata or the individual unit owner? So if it originates in the Strata common property, say your unit is below a common area, and say the kitchen sink from that common area has leaked, and it gets into your unit, and it damages your the insulation above your unit, it damages your unit ceiling, and it gets onto your carpets. It is the Strata that will be responsible for that if it comes from common area. If the leak originates, say, from the unit's kitchen sink above you, it's the unit above you that's responsible for it. Okay? Hopefully that clears up. These questions are really common questions that get asked on stratas. So in examining, going back to the depreciation reports, examining the site is very important, because if that landscape is changed at all, it could damage the membrane. It depends on the drains. So the site where it's located is really important. The landscaping around it will help protect it. In this case, they have a lot of wood. Wood rots over time. So this is something that really needs to be looked at too, is not only that, and then look at the replacement. When was all this wood replaced last? When's it going to come up to be replaced next? So that's another thing that you have to look at. And then they look at the paving. The hard paving includes the asphalt paving laneways, because you know what? The city owns up until property line, and after that, there's no common driveways or alleyways or parking lots or common parking areas, and that is all the expense. And as we know, heavy trucks and that can damage the pavement. Weather can damage the pavement. Perhaps the mixture wasn't right and it doesn't withhold. Perhaps we have extreme heats and it affects the pavement. There's all kinds of things that are outside the spectrum of what they feel that the pavement may last. So take a look at that. When was it last repaired? Perhaps there was an underground pipe that leaked and it damaged the pavement. That has to be repaired, and at whose expense? Because even the stratas have deductibles. Somebody says, would that apply? Would that then apply if a roof leak? Yeah, the roof leak is common property. So if it affects the units underneath, yes, that's common property. So it would be the strata. So yeah, so they look at all the different components of it. And then the big one is the HVAC. So are the HVAC, is it an HVAC that is for the whole building? Or are each of the individual units, do they each have their own HVAC? Because that will be who is responsible. Is the HVAC budgeted into this? Is it not budgeted in? Perhaps there's an HVAC in the common area, and then each individual unit has their HVAC. So you have to look at this. In this one here, it says suites and the amenity buildings are heated by forced air furnaces. The amenity building furnace is gas fired and was manufactured by airflow electric, and sprinkler rooms are heated by electric baseboard heaters. We assume in-suite furnaces are the responsibility of the individual owners, and we assume the amenities building furnace and individual baseboard heaters can be replaced as needed as an operating expense. So they talk about the HVACs here, because HVACs can be very expensive to replace. And then they look at the plumbing. the domestic water system. So the domestic water is delivered underground and distributed via plastic PEX piping, where it's checked in the suite access. So they checked to see what it was in the suite access. So domestic hot water is generally by tank heaters, and the amenities building tank heater is gas fired with a heating input, and it tells you the heating input, and it's got the storage capacity. So you need, and it also goes on to talk about when it was manufactured, who manufactured it, and they're assuming, they make assumptions here. The amenities building tank hot water will replace as it falls under the operating expense. And then again, they assume that domestic water piping and heaters are the responsibility of the unit owners. So they're making general assumptions. However, we know assumptions are not always correct. So perhaps they incorrectly assumed on one of these things, and that could again affect the depreciation report. And then they go on and talk about the electrical. So they're assuming again that the transformers are owned and maintained by BC Hydro. What if they're not? What if a transformer blows? That can be a huge expense. What if they incorrectly assumed perhaps this was not owned by BC Hydro, but rather the building? And then the lighting. They talk about the lightings. You know, is there adequate lighting? Because we hear some stratas that they say that lighting is inadequate. That is something you can examine when you're there with your client. And then they talk about miscellaneous, so consulting services. From time to time, the building may need to hire engineers or lawyers or other professionals. And they have, in some instances, they have some of this money that's used for or put set aside in the contingency reserve fund. But a strata doesn't know when somebody's going to sue them. You know, perhaps maybe a slip and fall on ice because it was improperly salted, or maybe a handrail was broke that it wasn't replaced. You know, so there's all kinds of outside things that can happen that may not be contributed or funds put aside for that in the CRF. And then they talk about contingencies. Contingencies are for small and unexpected repairs or replacements. So in this particular case, this budget is a contingency of unexpected repairs and replacements that should be paid for the contingency reserve fund, i.e. unexpected repairs or replacement that are not specifically itemized in this depreciation report. But note, it's quite small. So it may not cover any outside unexpected expenses because it is set quite low. And then we go on, we talk about scope of work. So the scope of work is what was prepared for this whole depreciation. Why was it prepared? So this depreciation report, it was commissioned by the Strata plan and by the property management company in accordance with the proposal, and they give the date it was proposed, and they give the authorization date that it was received to proceed. So they talk about that, and then they talk about the mandate of this report. So as per the Strata Property Act regulations, we confirm our qualifications as follows. So they talk about who they are. They talk about their errors and omissions. They talk about, at the time of writing the report, no employee carries any ownership in the strata. What does that mean, and why is that important? Conflict of interest. So they're stating they have no conflict of interest. And in preparing this depreciation report for the strata, they're saying they have reviewed and visually evaluated the condition of the major components or the element components without completing any destructive testing. So they're saying we didn't damage the building. However, we went and physically examined it. We didn't sit in our office and say, yes, the roof is 20 years. It's been worn by X number of years. You know, we did a drone and put it up over the roof. They're saying we actually physically inspected it. And so they prepared an inventory of common elements as they expect to deteriorate, require repairs or replacements based on their best interpretation of the corporation documents. And they estimate the scope of repairs or replacements which will likely be required. And they predicted the times when repairs or replacements will be required as necessary, and the life expectancy. So again, we talked about the roof. It may have been 30-year life expectancy. They've only got 10 years. However, because of the materials or the local environment or whatever reason, it looks like it's worn at double the speed. So it may need to be replaced or will need to be replaced sooner than expected. But they've examined that, so they're aware of that. And then they talk about that they provided their opinion of the cost required to carry out the repairs or the replacements. And they calculated the various funding scenarios, determine options for the contribution into the CRF to plan for future expectations. So that's where we saw scenario 1, option number 1, scenario 2, which is option number 2, and scenario 3, option number 3, that a strata can choose from. And when we talk about the strata, it is voted on by all the owners. It is not the strata council that has the say in that. And they include items which typically require replacement because of their service life is shorter than the service life of the building, such as caulking or roofing or equipment, like we mentioned. But it also can include items that would not have been anticipated to be required when the building was new. So due to the specific deterioration of that building. So, you know, for instance, and we talked about the concrete repairs due to the poor durability or window modifications, the loss of the internal seals. We talked about that. And then there may be expenses to which arise which have not been anticipated related to the concealed conditions or unexpected deterioration. As long as these relate to the repair or replacement of the common elements, they can often be paid for out of the contingency reserve fund, provided the report is updated to account for the impact of these expenditures. So we talk about, if in doubt whether or not an expenditure can be paid out of the contingency reserve fund, they can always check with the building can always check with their legal counsel or a chartered accountant. And then it goes on here in this scope, it talks about the survey method. It talks about when they actually reviewed the building. When did they review the building? When did they look at the building? And the survey consisted of visual review portions of the building, including they talked about the suites reviewed in this building. They reviewed 2. So they had a very small sampling. And then the exterior walls, windows, doors from the exterior and the sample interior areas. So when they talk about the sample interior areas, it possibly was just the 2 suites plus common areas. And then they talk about the balconies and patios from the exterior and sample interior areas. And then they talk about the roof from grade. So what does it mean for roof from grade? Were they up on the roof, or did they just look up on ladders and look at it? Or did they stand on the ground and look at the roof? Well, you're not going to tell very much standing on the ground. And then they looked at the service rooms, the electrical and the sprinkler rooms, and then they looked at the perimeter of the site. And the information that was provided to them in order for them to complete this was depreciation report. They said they've reviewed the strata plan, the bylaws, the financial statements for May 2015 to November 2016. They looked at various quotes, invoices, and correspondence related to the gutter upgrades and attic investigations. They looked at the AGM and council minute meetings for 2014, 15, and 16. They also reviewed the architectural drawings that were provided by a company, and they date that they were done. And then two council members answered questions about the history of the performance of the various systems described in the existing capital plans. And then they talked about the report and the revisions. So then what they do is they take photographs of the components. So they provide visuals of the components. So we're talking about this building, we're reading about this building, but where exactly are you talking about? What am I looking at in this report compared to the actual photographs of the building? So they give the owners and the buyers visual to the common property that they may not have access to. And it gives visuals of any areas of concern and allows the reader to report a more in-depth sight of it. So if you look at the next photos, it's got photos of the various outside and the various components. They talked about the balconies. So they've provided photos of it. And then they go in and they're talking about the components. They talked about the laneway. They talked about the mailboxes. Well, here's the photos that you can understand what the writer is talking about in this report. And they talked about, the electrical disconnect switch. They talked about the amenities building mechanical system. They talked about the exercise and game rooms, and they talked about the meeting room. So this is what they look like. So if you've never been to the property, or maybe perhaps you've been to the property and you're unsure, these pictures will actually provide the visual. So they provide that for you. So let's talk about the Strata Property Act, Section 94. This is very important to understand about the depreciation reports. We now have an in-depth understanding of this particular property. Now let's talk about why these depreciation reports are required and how often. So the depreciation report is required if the Strata Property Act contains 5 or more strata lots. So typically anything under 5 lots or under, you will not see a depreciation report. And these reports are required every 3 years. Yeah, every 3 years. The reports can be waived, however, by way of a resolution with 3/4 vote at an annual or general special meeting. However, if waived by resolution, the report must be completed within 18 months from the date the resolution was passed. However, they can continually be waived by way of a resolution with 3/4 vote. And you say, why would somebody want to waive them? Well, these reports are very expensive to get. However, they provide a lot of in-depth knowledge. And perhaps the person reading these reports do not want to accept the findings. However, they do allow for long-term financial planning and stability of the building. As we know, and somebody talked about a strata wind-up, buildings do depreciate. And it comes to a point that a building may be so depreciated. However, that building may become ideal for a strata wind-up. So the physical inspections must be done with every report. So they can't look at the last report that was done and say, yeah, I saw the physical and there it was done. They actually need to go and physically examine that property. Perhaps the roof was fine the last time it was examined and this time it's not fine. Perhaps, the wind damaged the roof in the last snowstorm or windstorm or rainstorm or whatever. So they actually need to go and physically inspect the components. And the person qualified reports must meet and have the knowledge and expertise in order to prepare the report. So they provide a summary of the author's credentials and insurance certificate, these reports. And the strata corporations that were formed after December 14, 2011 are required to obtain a depreciation report within 6 months of the second annual general meeting. So any new buildings coming up are supposed to have a depreciation report within 6 months of the second annual general meeting. And somebody had asked earlier about this, strata reports. So today's session was provided to you with an understanding of how to read depreciation reports and what they mean. However, it is highly recommended you refer your client to a company that provides strata report readings. They will summarize the key points. And I've provided for you a few of existing companies here in BC that provide this type of service. However, there are many other companies that provide this service in BC. You can always reach out to other agents in your area, posted on workplace chat, and other agents would be happy to provide you with strata report readings. I believe it's Eli reports are available right on LTSA. So that brings an end to today's session. Is there any questions about today's depreciation reports or anything pertaining to stratas? No, everybody knows how to read a depreciation report now? No, Fraser, Wendy takes attendance or Jessica takes attendance. And at the end of every session, we post questions, and Wendy will walk you through that to get a certificate of completion today. Any questions on today's reports? You can open your mics and ask as well.
Hi, Kate. This is Mark Wong here, EXP.
Hey, Mark.
Hey, thanks for this session, and it's really informative. And I want to just ask a question about general, not the depreciation report, but just in general as far as looking at stratas. How do you determine if there's enough reserve in a building based on number of units, or like how do you look at that number and say, okay, $500,000, $1 million, is that enough?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and that's where you have to look at, the depreciation report. What has been replaced? What are the major components that have been replaced? How old are the components? If the components are all relatively new and you have a lower CRF, then the building may be in financial stability. However, you may have a lower CRF and nothing has been replaced. That may mean then the fact that there may be a special levy coming. And, it's not necessarily something where you say to your buyer, hey, you really need to think about this building. What you need to say to your buyer is, allow them to make the determining factor. And just so you're aware, there may be a special levy because, the contingency reserve fund I see is low. And, there's elements, major components of this building that still need to be replaced. So just so you're aware of that going in. So those are some of the things that you can see. Or the other thing you can say to them is, perhaps, I would recommend a strata report company that you have them go over and provide you a summary detail, and they will provide a summary detail. They're quite detailed in what they do read. We are not experts in reading strata documents or budgets or depreciation reports. However, we should have a general understanding of it. I always highly recommend that anytime a client is buying a strata, that they do have a strata reporting agency. And the other thing, remember, it removes some liability from you in the fact that you have a record. You've emailed them, here's the name of 3 companies to read the report. So you're saying, hey, I gave you the opportunity to do it. But verbally saying, here's 3 strata companies, here, call them. It becomes then they have selective memory later on if something should occur. So always document everything in an email and always provide several companies so they can't say, well, you pointed me into the direction of this company and, they provided me misinformation.
Okay. And then what about buildings that been putting depreciation report off for many, many years? I mean, I guess at the point there is a lot of risk involved, right?
There is a lot of risk involved, and why are they putting it off? For instance, it's a strata windup perhaps coming up, and it's in an area where all the buildings are torn down, and it's not a big concern for them because they know in 3 to 5 years that building is going to be a strata windup. However, the other point is there was a strata building that put off doing a depreciation report, and there ended up being a big leak, and some strata lot owners wanted the leak repaired, some didn't because it was coming to a special levy, and it went to court, and the judge ordered all the strata lot unit owners had to contribute to the special levy. And it was a quite large, it happened a couple of years ago, it was quite large. It was like $60,000 or $80,000 each unit had to contribute. So you want to make sure that when the components are, have your clients read the report, have informed buyers. Those are the best kind of buyers to have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just the last question: is there a relationship from between the operating budget, like how much that is in comparison percentage-wise to like the reserve that we need to be thinking about? Kind of just a basic idea.
Yeah. So generally, they should be, if it's a healthy, and again, it goes depending on if they chose option 1, 2, or 3, but general rule of thumb, about 10% of that should be put away each month. But again, remember, that's going to vary depending on how healthy your budget is. You can also, I go further into depth on setting up CRF from the beginning and the contributions and so on to that in the Strata session. So you do have the Strata session that is available in the EXP BC resource site. So take a look at that and review that session. It goes in quite into depth. Kia and I ran that session back a few weeks ago. But yeah, it goes into depth about that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Kate, regarding the leakage, again, I'm coming on the leakage. If cause repair costs are itself very expensive, and that's why we have taken our insurance for inside the unit. And if the owner comes to know that there is a leakage and there is a damage to the underneath unit as well, will they go for the insurance companies to reimbursement for those costs or not?
So Vikas, that's a good question. And if you were to dig deeper into, and we don't do this, but if you were to dig deeper into individuals' insurance policies, you're going to find now on a lot of these strata lot owners, the deductible is $250,000. You heard me, $250,000. And so the reason, and that's for water damage and so on. And the reason for that is because insurance companies know and they want owners to take responsibility for their water leakages because they cause more insurance claims than anything. And so if a leak is, $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, then in most cases it's the strata unit lot owners that are responsible, and there's no sense even going to the insurance company because your deductible is way higher. Does that make sense?
Yes.
That's why a strata lot unit owner wants to say, oh, it's the strata's fault, it was on their property. And that's why if it's on a pipe, say, coming into under the kitchen sink, and the strata lot owner is saying, no, it's not me, it's in between the walls. So that's why they really have to investigate to find out where did the leak originate, because the strata doesn't want to pay for it, the strata unit owner doesn't want to pay for it. Remember, if the Strata is paying for it, you know, and there's a large deductible, where's it coming from? The CRF. And that is an unexpected that could affect the CRF. Any other questions? Awesome. Well, hopefully you all found today's session valuable and you learned a little bit about depreciation reports and what's aimed in a depreciation report. And just one last caveat, remember, we're not experts in this. This was provided for knowledge only, so you can assist your client standing, so you can have an understanding of the stability of the building. Always give your client 3 strata companies that they can do a report for them. And I'll turn it over to the amazing Wendy and Jessica so they can ask the magical questions so you can get your certificates today. Thanks everyone for attending and happy Friday.
Awesome, thank you, Kate. Jessica here, I will be helping out. So hello everybody, we are ready for your practice quiz. I am going to share a link in the chat at the end. So you need to log into your OTCA account and click Mindflash Trackstar, and you will paste the link in the URL to get started. And once you've answered all of the questions, please go all the way to the end of the slides to find your certificate. Just click View Certificate to download it. This is all you will need to provide to your board association for your 2 self-directed PDP hours. So let's start with our questions. Question 1, what is the main purpose of a depreciation report? A, to show financial stability on yearly budgets. B, to assist the building with long-term financial planning of the CRF. Or C, to provide the exact costs of replacement of major components of the building. Okay, so the correct answer for this one is B, to assist the building with long-term financial planning of the CRF. That is the main purpose of a depreciation report. Going on to question 2, why is it highly recommended that your clients obtain a summary report? A, it provides an in-depth knowledge of the issues in the building. B, it provides a summary on the building structure and components for long-term financial planning. Or C, it provides the buyer with knowledge on the components of the building only. So why is it highly recommended that your clients obtain a summary? A, it provides an in-depth knowledge of the issues in the building. B, it provides a summary on the building structure and components for long-term financial planning. Or C, it provides the buyer with knowledge on the components of the building only. The answer for this one is B as well. So I will drop a link in the chat. Moment. So here is the link to our practice quiz. Again, just log into your OTCA account and click Mindflash Trackstar. Paste this link into the URL to get started. And once you've answered all the questions, go all the way to the end of the slides to find your certificate. Click View Certificate to download it, and that is all you need to provide your board for your 2 self-directed PDP hours. Thank you, everybody, and have a great Friday.
Thanks, Wendy and Jessica, for your help today.
Thanks, Kate. So if anybody called in, feel free to message me on Workplace Chat if you need the link.